Beginning with a reading from 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 to 11. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Have you ever been afraid? Well, we all experience fear, don't we? Now more than ever, perhaps, this global pandemic has created a lot of uncertainty and fear. How do you deal with fear? I'm focusing a lot on the character Saul. This wasn't the first time Saul was afraid, and it wouldn't be the last. Saul was the first king of Israel. But something interesting about Saul, even though he was a mighty warrior king and in many ways quite successful, there are many cases where the Bible says he was afraid. Here's what happened when Saul was first chosen as king in 1 Samuel 10, verses 20 to 24. Then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clan of the Matrites was taken by lot. And Saul the son of Kish was taken by lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, "Is there a man still to come?" And the Lord said, "Behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage." Then they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. And Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." I think that's kind of a funny scene. He's about to be made king, and he hides himself among the baggage. He was afraid. He looked impressive. As soon as he stood up, people were impressed because of his height. But on the inside, he didn't feel impressive. He didn't feel like someone who could handle all the responsibility of being a king. After Saul was established as king, there was another time when the Philistines had mustered for war, and Israel didn't seem to stand a chance. Here's how Saul responded. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, 'Now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord.' So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." That's 1 Samuel 13, 8 to 14. Here Saul was afraid, because the Philistines were looking strong, and his own warriors were scattering, and his fear led to disobedience. He offered the burnt offering himself when he was supposed to wait for Samuel to come and offer it. He was too afraid to wait another hour. And this disobedience was the beginning of the end of his kingdom. The Lord had sought out another man, a man after his own heart. Then in 1 Samuel 15, we have another case where Saul was afraid and his fear led to disobedience. This time he was afraid of his own people. The Lord had sent Saul to repay the Amalekites for opposing Israel when they came up out of Egypt. He asked Saul to wipe them out completely, not sparing a single person or animal. And here's what happened. And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. 1 Samuel 15, 7 to 9. Afterward, when Samuel confronted Saul and rebuked him for this disobedience, Saul admitted that he had given in to what the people wanted. They wanted to save the best of the animals to sacrifice to the Lord. Of course, they weren't being really selfless and worshipful in that. They would get to eat a lot of the meat that way, rather than watch it all burn. 1 Samuel 15:24 says, Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice." Okay, so sometimes Saul was afraid. At some key times in his life and his career as king, he was afraid. And sometimes acting on that fear cost him dearly. Now we come back to the situation that I began with in 1 Samuel 17, where again Saul is afraid. To be fair, everyone is afraid, because the biggest, strongest warrior they've ever seen is asking for a challenger. But then something strange happened. A kid showed up. Well, not exactly a kid, but a young man, David by name. He was actually already employed at this time by Saul, part-time as a musician, but at the time of this battle he was keeping his father's sheep. 3 of his older brothers were there with Saul in the camp, and David's father sent him to bring them some food and to make sure that they were okay. While he was in the camp, he saw the situation, which by the time he had arrived had been going on for 40 days already. Every day the two armies would line up. Goliath would step forward and issue his challenge, and no one dared fight him. They just run back to camp and, I guess, hope that Goliath wouldn't be there again tomorrow. But when David came, he saw this, and it didn't sit well with him. He didn't like it that Goliath was making fools of them all, especially since they were the Lord's people. So he started asking people what would be done for the man who took down Goliath. And after a while, word came to Saul that someone was interested in taking on Goliath. I'd like to go ahead and read the rest of it. I think it's written better than I can retell it. 1 Samuel 17, picking it up in verse 31, and I'll go to verse 54. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Now, stop there. Wow, pretty courageous. Pretty courageous young David. So what was the difference between Saul and David? Besides the fact that one was a mighty warrior king and the other was a little shepherd boy. Why was Saul afraid and David filled with courage? Simply put, when faced with something frightening, Saul tended to look to himself and see how vulnerable he was, while David looked to the Lord. Let's look at the evidence. 1 Samuel 9, 17 to 21. When Samuel first met Saul. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, "Here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall restrain my people." Then Saul approached Samuel in the gate and said, "Tell me, where is the house of the seer?" Samuel answered Saul, "I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for today you shall eat with me, and in the morning I will let you go and will tell you all that is on your mind. As for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not set your mind on them, for they have been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for all your father's house?" Saul answered, "Am I not a Benjaminite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me in this way?" Saul was very humble about his heritage, and I think he did have some reason for that. At the end of the book of Judges, which chronologically is just previous to 1 Samuel, it tells the story of how the rest of the tribes of Israel went to war with Benjamin because a city in Benjamin had committed an outrageous sin. As a result, the tribe of Benjamin had been greatly reduced. Now, we don't know exactly how long ago that was from Saul's perspective. In Judges, it just says that it happened in the days when there was no king. I would think that it was probably before Samuel's time, since he was a strong leader in Israel, but it was recent enough to be felt and become part of Saul's identity, that he was part of this tribe that had been in the wrong and had been greatly reduced in numbers. Now, after he was king, when he had battled the Amalekites, in 1 Samuel 15, draw your attention to verses 12 and 17. In verse 12, "And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on, and went down to Gilgal." And then later, speaking to Saul in verse 17, and Samuel said, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel." Normally, I would think that someone who set up a monument for himself was a big guy in his own eyes. He thinks he's important, but it can be just the opposite, as it was for Saul. He was little in his own eyes, and probably the first person he was trying to impress with his monument was himself. He wanted to believe that he could be someone great, but he was full of self-doubt. I I think this was Saul's undoing. He was insecure about himself. And when he was faced with these frightening things, he would think, well, I can't be king. I can't face this Philistine army when my own army is scattering. I can't stand up to the people when they want to go against the Lord's command. I'll be mobbed. I can't stand up to Goliath. I'll be killed. And I'm not saying that he needed to have more confidence in himself. He needed to have more confidence in the Lord, who had chosen him to be king and to lead Israel to victory in battle. On the other hand, what was David's approach? We heard a lot of it already. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And I'll let David continue to speak in his own words from the Psalms. Psalm 56, verses 3 and 4 and 10 and 11. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? In God, whose word I praise. In the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Psalm 23, verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Psalm 27, 1-3. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. God is strong and mighty, and he loves us and he is with us. If we only stack ourselves up against the things that frighten us, then yeah, that's frightening. But only because we've left God out of the equation. If we look to him, we find courage. That's David's advice. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. So when you are afraid, remember this prayer, the one from Psalm 56. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Whatever it may be that causes you fear, this is always a good prayer. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. And why don't we close in prayer now? God, thank you that we can trust you, that you are greater than all the things that may cause us fear. And I pray that you would help us to have the attitude that David had, that when there are frightening things, we look to you and find courage and confidence in you. Help us not to be like Saul in just looking at ourselves and all the ways that we may not be up to whatever the challenge is. Lord, I pray that it would be something that each of us here would really put into practice. That when we are afraid, we would trust in you. Help us to trust in you now. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.